and I would say a few introductory words, and then we're good for your keynote.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I hope everyone is back on the stream with us, because it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Babafemi Folorunso to you, who is our day's keynote speaker. Dr. Folorunso is a theatre officer at Creative Scotland, formerly Scottish Arts Council, where his work covers a wide range, including funding, practice, and career developments, as well as project monitoring. He is, in this context, the lead officer for 5 regularly funded organizations: the Cumbernauld Theatre, the Theatre Gouleor, the Dundee Rep, the Magnetic North, and the Beacon Arts Centre. Dr. Babafemi Folorunso further holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Edinburgh, and he is a frequent lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, the Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria, as well as the Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, the University of Dundee, and, lucky for us, also at the Mozarteum Salzburg. So it is, as said, with great pleasure, Femi, that we are looking forward to your thoughts about aesthetics, communities, networking, and the question of new republics. Femi, we're excited for this keynote.
Thank you very much, Judith. And let me start by thanking the organizers of the conference for the invitation, and also confess my disappointment at not being able to be in the lovely city of Salzburg. I was really looking forward to being in Austria, but these are extremely difficult times for all of us. It's a shame. It's also my first time in the past 14 or so months that we've been in lockdown all over the place to be doing this kind of presentation. So I would beg your indulgence if I get anything wrong. It feels rather uncomfortable, which for a theater person is the way it should be. After all, theater is supposed to be the most social of the art forms, and the old definition is still subsists: a stage, a performance, stage, performer, performance, and then you have theater and audience. I don't think doing this virtual thing meets up to the standards of theater. Anyway, I'll try my best to have that kind as best a communication as I can possibly do. Let me begin also by saying that it's not been that easy choosing a topic for a conference of this nature, especially at this time, partly because of what I said earlier on, the condition imposed on all of us, but also more importantly, the fact that we are meeting at a time of visceral fear, both for individuals and nations across the world. And this is launching into my presentation. As at last night, for example, 3,158,241 deaths have been recorded globally from the coronavirus pandemic. 11,077 of these deaths occurred yesterday alone. And then we should also bear in mind that differences in the recording or counting of both the death and positive cases in many countries may mean that the actual figures for deaths and infections are higher than what we are given, higher than what we get daily. But dreadful and harrowing as the past 15 or so months have been, we have also seen most people across the world turning to one another in a demonstration of a form of solidarity that was thought to have been destroyed forever by the age of greed into which we had all settled before the pandemic. And here I want to pause to say that as we're also talking glossary, it's a pity that I'm not able to distribute the paper ahead. I've also underlined a few words in this presentation, and those words I would like you to underline as well as I speak along. What I'll do is that I'll mention each of them, and I'll say this underline, because they will form words in my view, which I think should build into any future glossary we're putting together in terms of theater and society. I've called my presentation Arts and Society, clarification of a few points. So while on the idea of solidarity is underlined, there is much to be discussed in how the coronavirus pandemic has become the basis for what increasingly appears to be a new way or ways of looking at the world. This is more so in relation to how governments across countries of advanced capital, so we're talking of Western countries, North America, and one or two countries in Asia, beyond the Western Hemisphere. We're also looking at a place like China, India, a very poor example. But we can see that in many of those countries, it all depends on what model of classification you want, but I prefer a more solidly ideological one. Countries of advanced capital and middle income in terms of rising economies. But in such countries, we've also seen how those countries are disavowing over the past year the orthodoxies of the said previous age of greed. As things stand today, we seem to be witnessing the return of the state as a guarantor of both civility and equality. Those two words are underlined, civility and equality. And some would say, welcome to the new Leviathan. What's Leviathan? The idea of democracy, which is promoted and sustained by a strong state. It goes back to John Mills, the British philosopher. For optimists everywhere, we must let the assumed promise of the moment. We must not let the assumed promise of the moment make us ignore the injustices of the recent past. This then is a paradox that we face. Whatever the trajectory of what I describe as the new Leviathan, I personally do not believe that the arts are going to suffer any worse or even become better than the rest of society in the aftermath of the current pandemic. What I do hope, however, is that art, and in particular the performing arts, will feel more energized than before to take on the challenge of democracy, as opposed to seemingly appearing to be echoing democracy. This is a subject, this is an issue that interests me most keenly in the light, particularly of what we witnessed last summer, the protests across the world in the fight for racial justice and equality. And most significantly, the disclosure that came out of the United States, how suddenly in the aftermath or as a consequence of the Floyd's death, the brutal murder, we also saw something unusual in the US. It was as if every part of the US, people were exhuming corpses of racial injustice, of brutalities that we had not seen before. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't abstract. All kinds of videos were circulating of children, Black children, as young as 8-year-olds, being manhandled by the police, of dogs being unleashed on racial minorities. And just as we thought we had seen the better part of that, in the past 2-3 months, we had also seen attention shifted from the Black minority to Asian minorities. And suddenly, we are being told of how much such violence against the Asians had been kept off the public sphere. So we see this violence. So the violence, this racial violence, had become an everyday occurrence in America. And over the past 50 years, not many people knew how embedded and how surreal, how brutal, indeed barbaric, that violence had been. So when we talk about democracy in such context, what about that context? What about the issue of civility and transcendental humanity of those minorities? This is not the place to elaborate on my reasons for declining to accept the assumption that our current practice, that is the arts, is still wholly reflective of the liberal tradition that tolerates dissenting voices. The question for me is who has voice as opposed to what is tolerated. Although I speak mainly from a UK perspective, I think a number of these observations can be found either in latent or emergent forms in many parts of Europe. We have seen over the past 20 years how the idea of arts for all has been made into a substitute for the respectability, the absence of the respectability that goes with citizenship. Citizenship, that's another underlying word, as a given presence in the way we interact with one another. For example, in the UK, at the onset of the new millennium, one had such remarks as, and I'm quoting someone here, the arts and culture play increasingly prominent role in social change, particularly internationally. Culture, more broadly, is an important foundation for living and therefore cannot be ignored in enabling people to envision and change their lives. Increasingly, it has been noted that sustainable development programs that ignore the cultural dimension tend to fail because they are not culturally sensitive. Unquote, end of quotation. Statements such as this were framed by the idea of social inclusion, which became a buzzword here in the UK in the early years of the millennium. In those years, quoting another authority, social inclusion policy had a dramatic impact on the public provision of the arts, controlling funding outcomes, defining employment opportunities, transforming the character of cultural programs, and shaping the form of finished works. For many art managers and politicians, such extensive influence has been benign. Inclusion policy encourages a democratization of cultural practice and stimulates quantifiable social and economic progress. It compels elitist institutions and distracted artists to be more socially aware. It offers the target population a range of benefits, not the least of which is the acquisition of skills to help them contribute more effectively to the world of work. If social inclusion policy overtly instrumentalizes cultural practice, the logic went, then this is justified in terms of its progressive outcome, a culture and society both more equal and democratic, unquote. Yet, for all its seductive appeal, social inclusion policy is, according to sociologists and social policy specialists, a reactionary concept to mask the widening gulf between cultural practice and public policy. To that extent, social policy in the arts has suffered very little either to aesthetics or to progressive social change. And as some critics have actually put it, the most lasting influence of social inclusion, that is, may be that of distracting attention from the cultural and political measures required to combat rising inequality and its ever diminution of human potential. So in other words, I'm saying here, over the past, or for the better part of the last 20 years, we had this mantra of social inclusion in a British context, which dominated everything from the level of art funding, art discourse, whether the level of what people call high art or low art. So much of social inclusion, and everybody got on the train of this social inclusion. But the fundamental thing missing in all that is that in this, we also forget that social inclusion is good to the extent that you actually have a democratic accountability. And democratic accountability enables you to to come up with cultural and political measures, because underpinning artistic behavior in such context is also that at least in our context here in the UK, we could see rising inequality. We could see the artist, when he or she goes to school, also needs to pay fees. The artist also needs shelter over his or her head. And in a context where the rhetoric of social inclusion takes away the old concept, idea of policy making, what happens? It is the diminution of human potential. It is a displacement of human potential. So I speak of human potential, that's another underlying two words. From another perspective, which is that of inequality on the one hand, and racialization of that inequality on the other hand. The folly of racialization plays out across a range of public discourses, but especially around issues of cultural production. Looking through those discussions, it is possible to detect a pattern regarding questions of culture, immigration, and rights. One can trace iterations or discussions of ideas that are not so different from previous articulations. Indeed, the French philosopher who incidentally died a few weeks ago, Etienne Balibar, describes new racism in terms of this new discussion, which is about culture, immigration, and rights, what I call racialization of inequality. Etienne Balibar actually describes it very aptly in another context. I mean, it amounts to what Etienne Balibar describes as neo-racism, without the old manifestation. Of course, Balibar was talking about the French situation. As Balibar suggests, all the new hypotheses concerning culture, immigration, and rights, whether in Britain or even in continental Europe, have been formulated on the basis of an internal critique of theories, of discourses, which then turn out to legitimate policies of exclusion based on anthropology or the so-called philosophy of history. So, for example, in the British context, the discourse of rights for racial minorities, which circulates in government policies, here, as in recent years, shifted from the pliable equal opportunities emphasis to the idea of multiculturalism. And the first iteration, which is that of equal opportunity. If the idea of equal opportunity was a formulaic, a technocratic construct to keep accusations of racism at arm's length, the second, that of multiculturalism, has resulted in becoming a benign celebration of inequality and a dispersal of the blame for people's inability to climb out of the racial stereotypes. This is the way the thorny issue of equality of opportunity has been recast. So what I'm saying here is that in the past 20 years, we've moved away from the idea of equality of opportunity as a singular opportunity there, as a singular word, to equality of opportunities. In other words, this new, we're playing with language, is a new regime that makes everybody accept the less dignified position of being racial minorities, of being minority of any type, whether it's on the basis of gender, whether it's on the basis of sexual orientation. And the more those things are promoted in government circles, embraced in government circles, without matching policy alternatives that actually restores, that actually promotes citizenship, the more the violence that goes with them becomes normalized as everyday practice. That's the point I'm trying to make here. So the issue of equality of opportunity is recasted in many ways. But inequality is no more resolved today than it was in the post-Second World War period, or even post-First World War period, when the conservative British writer Mallock noted that if democracy was realized and social conditions were equalized, there would be no such thing as opportunity, equal or unequal for anybody. Now, that was a politician in the post-First World War era talking about equality, even a politician from the right, which if you were to bring that politician back today, it would look extremely radical, left-wing, to even politicians on the left, because he could say that if equality, that if democracy was realized and social conditions were equalized, there will be no such thing as opportunity, equal or unequal. So if one considers the critique either of multiculturalism or what I call this trope of immigration, culture, and race, none of the critics seemed troubled by the obfuscations of its founding principles. The major concern will appear to be the unintended but clearly visible elevation of entitlement rights for racial minorities in recent legislation, and how that entitlement is deployed in policies that have grown out of those legislations. So people accept on the face of it that yes, we need pluralism, we need equality of opportunities. But what then becomes the problem is that when in the political terrain, we suddenly see legislations, ideas, which actually defend that new legal right, what do we have? The recourse to violence. A very clear example. There is no better example anywhere than what is going on in the US. The emergence of Asian middle class as a very powerful unit that can claim citizenship right has also generated another violence. Even if we are going to accept the not acceptable, but if we're going to take for a moment, pause to say that the anti-Black racism is part of the originary sin, foundation of American society, what about the Asian violence? There's a lot to unpick there. And unsurprisingly, much of this has become part of the race and nation complex. Nowhere is this more prevalent as in the liberal circle, at least, where the race and nation complex has been framed as a progressive dilemma. It is argued among the liberal elite, for example, that too much diversity leads to the erosion of solidarity. And this argument is on the basis that those who are diverse in the context of race in particular were those with significant religious and ethnic divisions. As if, so these are people who are not like us. The diverse are people who are not like us. Forgetting that there are other types of diversity pre-existing in the so-called newly diverse societies. But this is all, and the way this argument is carried on all the time is to adopt false dichotomies, including a supposed incompatibility between racial diversity and solidarity. That's another word, racial diversity and solidarity. I think we underlined solidarity much earlier. Those are words to underline again. The progressive dilemma argument suggests that in the face of diversity, the notion of citizenship as, and I quote, equal legal, political, and social rights and duties for people inhabiting a given national space is inadequate. In other words, what is citizenship? Citizenship is very simply equal rights, equal legal, political, and social rights and duties for people inhabiting a given national space. So implied but not stated in this thinking, of course, when the so-called progressive dilemma rejects that notion of citizenship, what it is saying basically is to reject what has become a standard norm, especially in British culture, in British law, not necessarily in European law, but it also occurs in, I mean, that's the tension in European law over citizenship has always been between what you call jus solis, which is law of the soil, and jus sanguinis, which is law of the blood. In the British case, law of the soil, which goes back to 16th century, there was that famous judgment by Justice Mansfield. Those who are familiar with British history will remember this was Mansfield said, anybody who has set foot on England is considered a free man, a free citizen. It's not about blood. It's about being, it's the law of the soil. That citizen has set his or her foot on the soil, that citizen has become a citizen. And this was re-echoed during the French Revolution, when I think it was the counter-revolutionary movements, I cannot remember, when the Jews approached the revolutionary leaders, and there was a particular one, when the Jews said they wanted a special protection, and the revolutionary leader responded, to you as Jews, nothing. To you as French citizens, everything. That's a continuation of the jus solis in a different form. In other parts of Europe, that tension remains today. And I'm arguing that one of the reasons it's so easy to racialize easily is also because of this tension. When I'm speaking ahead of myself, the progressive dilemma lies in what obviously is its contra reading of the idea of citizenship and its subsequent use of that reading to reassert the false anthropological definitions of culture. And so when we use culture in modern times, even among progressives in the West, and especially in a place like the US, it's always about unchangeable cultural traits that define behavior and intellectual capacity. It's that notion. Citizenship, however, ought to be reclaimed. So the challenge we face is that not only do we need to reject that mindset, this notion, that false anthropological definitions of culture, which creates a barrier. What we need to adopt instead is the idea of citizenship as both a principle and a basis of policy making in a chaotic world and in national politics. So the so-called progressive dilemma is, in my opinion, an example of what Etienne Baliba describes as misrecognition, a strategy that makes the violence of racism tolerable to those who engage in it. Misrecognition, that's another word to underline. A strategy that makes the violence of racism tolerable to those who engage in it. An aspect of this can also be seen in what Baliba also describes as academic racism. Misrecognition also feeds into academic racism, which relies on the process of theory building that attempts to mimic scientific discursive vocabulary by basing themselves on visible evidence. In other words, the Africans are this, the East Europeans are that, Polish do this, and so on and so forth, which you find in all these confined national spaces. So it's all about myth making, but it's very, very effective academic racism because they are very, very intelligible to the masses, to the mass of the people, those who actually go into the streets to inflict violence, or those who claim in the name of the state, such as the train operators who ask you at the station, or at the airport, who ask you very obviously, very transparent, very unhidden, very clear racist questions. Every racial minority goes through this at least once every 30 days. They seem harmless, but there are always these anthropological justifications for them. And this is what Baliba calls academic racism, because it's always based on a very futile, very meaningless, visible evidence, which are intelligible to such people. Such theory building poses not only a dilemma for those wishing to discuss citizenship on the basis of primary rights and duties, but also aims at justifying the denial of such rights in the state's everyday relationship with racial minorities. That's the whole idea. If people have those theories, they can go out, their interaction, and visit violence, verbal violence, which is as destructive, as soul destroying as physical violence in these types of interaction. Above all, one can think about the energy with which cultural debate had been invaded in the last 2 decades. So the point I'm trying to make here clearly is this: when we put all this together, how this our language of citizenship has been modeled, how it has also lain on the history of anthropological misinformation and all that. There's a pattern. There's a pattern, which ironically is also tied to what we're seeing. And that pattern is that the fact that you find that in the last 2 decades, it is the cultural debate which has been invaded by politics. And the reason for that, I am saying, is because politics itself has become impotent. There has been the impotence of the political itself. And as one commentator puts it, having lost its ability to change the forces of global economy, those are 2 other words to underline. The political, it seems, can now attempt to exercise control only over culture. So we've moved away from the idea of the political within boundaries to the idea of culture as a substitute for what is lost in terms of global relationship, global interaction, in terms of the global economy. So the emergence of China, I mean, this has come out in the past 2 weeks. The emergence of China now means that Europe has a fight, has a cultural fight on its hand. But the fact that within Europe, production, industrial production is being shifted to China because of low wage labor, because of lack of accountability. Those are not issues to be discussed. The issue to be discussed is that because they work so hard in China on conditions which are very close in some respects to 19th century industrialization conditions in Europe, are we suggesting that we go back there? So this is, rather than facing those, what we now have is that politics is invading the cultural terrain, and so on and so forth. So the impotence of the political is diffused both in terms of the shrinking citizenship within national confines, but also the violence, even within that shrinking citizenship. We also have the racialization of inequality within. And that creates violence for racial minorities, and indeed for all minorities. As one commentator notes, social and political issues cannot be direct subject of art. And this commentator is obviously talking about visual arts. This fact is made evident by the earlier failures of the historical avant-garde and the philosophical background of the 20th century. Heideggerian propositions suggest that the catastrophe of modernity has already happened and that art moves in its own zone, which is not that of daily reality. In relation to its cultural context, art operates vertically, escaping any direct correspondence with the social or political, since otherwise it would lose all capacity to reflect critically upon them. Capacity to reflect critically. Those are also underlined words. Capacity to reflect critically. An art that is accessible or reflects only daily reality derives from an impoverishment of thought dispossessed of any imaginative faculty. It is less than reality itself and neutralizes any possibility of nourishing the viewer's experience. So which leads me to the closing segment, that when we look at practice, when we look at society, practice cannot thrive if we do not have a healthy democracy. Autonomy of the artist to practice can always be there, but the autonomy has to be seen more within the conditions of artistic production itself. And for as long as citizenship is embattled, that becomes a terrain for even artistic production. Fighting for citizenship itself is not artistic. It is given, it is something. But the artist or art itself cannot exist, cannot secure its own autonomy when, or production, when the field of democracy, which is the only way of guaranteeing citizenship, is embattled. But one continues to live in hope. And if I may take the liberty to corrupt the words of Bertolt Brecht, that the artists themselves will still living in fear of production. To cease to live in fear of production means that you also make the work sit within what I call this democratic accountability, the deepening of democracy with which I began, and to challenge that notion of citizenship within our practice. As Brecht puts it, you never know where you are with production. Production is the unforeseeable. You never know what's going to come out. If vitality is going to come out of the arts, if the art is going to be part of what it has always been, then the autonomy that it craves, the power that is alluded to it, will come from the art, stopping to live in fear of production. Not living in fear of production means engaging, means confronting what I call this academic racism. That's my conclusion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so very much, Femi, for these intense and inspiring words that I'm sure gave all of us a lot of food for thoughts. Thank you so much. As the procedure is now, let me first say 2 words to that, unfortunately, is that we will be saying bye to everyone online for right now. You have the Padlet that you're invited to, share your thoughts on your questions, start your own discussions, open up whatever comes to mind from what you just heard from Babafemi. And we'll be revising that later, You should have gotten the link to it, again, in the email yesterday. Again, if you haven't, shoot us an email and we'll get it to you. So we here in Salzburg have the pleasure of having the direct discussion with Femi. And for that, I'm saying bye now to everyone online. We're gonna cut the stream and you'll be coming back to us with the next link at 4 o'clock for the input on walking terms. And for that already now, luckily Andreas Bürgesser has joined us too, who you'll be meeting then. But for now, bye to the digital world and into the discussion with Femi.